Not-for-profit marketing, Part 1. Here are the learning outcomes for this part. First, we're going to introduce the different types of not-for-profit organizations that we find. We're going to highlight the importance of marketing for not-for-profit organizations, and we're going to introduce the characteristics that differentiate not-for-profit from our more familiar profit-making organizations. So why study the not-for-profit sector? Why learn about it at all? Well, this sector became increasingly important in the UK, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, as a direct result of policy changes by then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and those policies were then pursued by Tony Blair in the mid-1990s. These policies exposed public sector services to commercial market forces, and the policy change meant that non-profit organisations, whether they were in the public or the private sector, and we'll come on to discuss the details and the distinctions between those, these were to be held more accountable to us, the general public and taxpayer. Not-for-profit organisations now had to compete with each other in a similar manner to the way that the commercial sector did. And the implications for the marketer were that marketing and business principles were to be adapted and applied to the specific not-for-profit sector, especially for organisations that held charitable status. So we see that not-for-profit organisations were exposed to commercial forces, they were exposed to increasing competition, and so there was a need for professionalised marketing emerging within the sector. The not-for-profit sector is populated by organisations such as local government, churches, museums, universities, zoos and public hospitals. And all of these organisations operate without profit as their central goal. There are three main types of not-for-profit organisations. There's the public sector, the private sector, which includes charities, and social enterprises. Now, this can be confusing, but as we'll come on to talk about across this topic, the sources of income tend to be the distinguishing feature of whether you can classify a not-for-profit organisation as belonging to the public sector or the private sector. Now, within the United Kingdom, the Charities Commission tell us that over £30 billion is raised every year by hundreds of thousands of charities, nearly 200,000 charities. However, only 421, or around 420, of these charities account for nearly half of the overall funds raised within the country. So that shows us that 0.2% of the registered charities account for over 40% of funds raised. When we're talking about these three different kinds of not-for-profit organisations, we start to encounter the blurred lines that exist. So the classification of private sector, public sector and social enterprise is not always as rigid as it looks. There's a blurring, and you can have both public and private sector not-for-profit organisations in the same place. For example, in the UK, an NHS hospital might take on private patients. So you could argue that that is a form of private sector income, even though NHS hospitals are publicly funded in general. But that could be regarded as the generation of income to offset costs, so it's still not directly profit making in the true commercial sense of the idea, because the objective is not to create profit for shareholders. Could you regard it therefore as a social enterprise? It's difficult to classify. All public sector organisations are legally governed by the government New Public Sector Management Initiative. So you may have come across before the PFI, Private Finance Initiative, or PPP, Public-Private Partnerships. These mean that when the private sector is regarded to have the expertise to deliver something at a lower cost, for example, a certain kind of service delivery within a hospital, then that service should be implemented to the benefit of both the taxpayer and the private sector supplier, who will inevitably generate revenue and profit from the arrangement. So car parks in hospitals may be contracted out to a private car park provider, or at a school where the estates, the governance of the land and the buildings is hired out to a private facilities manager. The local council would manage the core delivery of education in that school, and the private sector was delivering with better value for money a certain part of the operation. The structure of education itself can be complicated as well. The OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, defines universities in the UK as private, even though they draw most of their financial support from the government. So the OECD defines them as government-dependent private, a slightly strange definition, meaning that they are autonomous in terms of how they make decisions around their spending, and they are not immune from bankruptcy, but they are funded directly by the taxpayer. But to add further complexity, they still operate in a competitive system, i.e., one university competes with other universities for students. Then there are other types of universities. You have completely private charities who rely solely on student fees and other funding, such as the University of Buckingham in London. And then there are some purely profit-making universities that exist directly to make money from student fees in order to deliver profit to their owners. For example, in the UK we have the University of Law and BPP University. A social enterprise is a business with primarily social objectives whose surpluses are principally reinvested for that purpose in the business or in the community, rather than being driven by the need to maximize profit for shareholders and owners. This is a contemporary phenomenon. It's a legal business structure. So in the UK, you register your business as a CIC, a CIC, a community interest company, which is the legal definition of a social enterprise. Social enterprises are growing in popularity, and even in the for-profit world, the impact and presence of social enterprise is meaning that people are redirecting their attention towards their social environmental impact through their business activities. So there are terms in the for-profit sector even such as profit for purpose, and social enterprises are the legal encapsulation of the idea of profit for purpose. So a social enterprise does not just measure its success on the basis of the bottom line financially for its owners or shareholders, but it also measures its business success on the basis of the social impact its activities generate. So this is a blending of social objectives and commercial reality. And there are several good examples, both locally to Scotland in the UK and around the world, which show the impact and positive effect that can be achieved through social enterprise. In the recent past, a reasonably famous example was Jamie Oliver's 15 Restaurant Foundation, which was a chain of restaurants which sought to create jobs for people who were leaving prison or who had been homeless, and this gave them the ability to create skills that led to employment and a sustainable income, and getting them out of poverty or reintegrating them to society. So these were restaurants that existed to make a profit, but if it were a normal commercial enterprise, it wouldn't be directing so much of its attention and resources towards recruiting and training members of its staff who were in what would be described as vulnerable positions, such as people who were recently released from prison or who had been homeless. So the for-profit agenda was being slightly displaced by the social agenda, and that led to overall positive impact, both a sustainable business and positive social impact all round. There is a new startup in Scotland called Good Call, which shows that even the tiniest parts of business operations can receive benefits from social enterprise objectives. So Good Call is a mobile phone provider which provides mobile phone lines and network coverage for business phones within the charity sector. So Good Call, rather than exposing charities who are always starved of resources, and every pound that they earn that is not spent on their direct beneficiaries is a difficult pound to spend. And what Good Call does is it, instead of driving up the prices of line rental to a level that charities can't justify, it gives a minimum fair and transparent rate which allows some charities to get business mobile phones that they wouldn't otherwise get. And if you want a really tangible and now world-renowned example of social enterprise in action, look for Social Bite in and around Edinburgh. This is a coffee, and it's like a pret-a-manger or a Costa coffee, but they employ homeless people or formerly homeless people in their kitchens in a similar way to Jamie Oliver's restaurant, and customers have the opportunity to pay forward for a meal or a hot drink for a homeless person, and at the end of the day every branch gives out all its leftover food to homeless people, and it's been an enormous success and had a really positive impact in the United Kingdom. Before we finish, we're just going to touch on the etymology of profit, because we traditionally talk about profit as being something that is concerned with financial profit, the leftover financial earnings after all other costs have been taken away. But it has a much broader meaning. When you look at its Latin and French Middle English roots, it really comes down to an advantage, a gain, a benefit, progress. So when we're talking about not-for-profit organizations, we're almost talking about a paradox, because actually they are making a profit. It's just the way in which we measure that profit has changed its meaning in some way. But any not-for-profit organization is making a significant contribution, but it just might not be measured financially. That concludes part one of our not-for-profit topic. So we've looked at how the not-for-profit sector has become increasingly exposed to market forces and competition, increasing the need for expertise in marketing. Also, we've become aware of the distinctive features of not-for-profit marketing that have meant that the marketing task is actually in some ways greater, and we'll come on to talk about that more in later sections. We've looked at the distinctions between public, private and social enterprise, public sector, private sector and social enterprise, and we've highlighted that there are often blurred lines among these different parts and complexity. That concludes part one. Next, we're going to be looking at the specific characteristics of not-for-profit marketing.